The October morning when Dylan Grant first set foot in Yosemite Valley, the air smelled like pine and old granite, and the Merced River ran clear and cold between banks of smooth river stones. Dylan had driven 15 hours straight from Albuquerque, his battered Volkswagen van packed with camera equipment, camping gear, and enough supplies for a 3-week solo expedition into the high country. At 31 years old, he was already building a reputation as a landscape photographer whose images captured something most others missed. Not just the grandeur of wilderness, but its quiet loneliness. The way light fell through forest canopy onto moss-covered rocks, like a prayer nobody was listening to. He checked in at the Wilderness Permit Office on October 15th, telling the ranger he planned to hike the Merced River corridor up toward Red Peak Fork, maybe push farther into the Cathedral Range if weather held. The ranger, a woman named Linda Cho, remembered him because he asked detailed questions about water levels and whether the river was running high from early season storms. She wrote his permit for 3 weeks, stamped it, and watched him walk back to his van with that particular gait of someone who carried heavy camera bags long enough that his shoulders had permanently adjusted. If you're watching this from somewhere in the world, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our viewers around the globe. Dylan's sister, Rebecca, received one postcard. It arrived at her apartment in Albuquerque 4 days after he left, postmarked from El Portal, the small community just outside the park boundary. The message was brief, written in Dylan's cramped handwriting. Rivers low but beautiful. Light is perfect in the mornings, heading upstream tomorrow. Love you, D. Rebecca kept that postcard in her wallet for 17 years, the edges soft and furry from handling, the ink faded to ghosts of letters. When Dylan didn't return by November 7th, Rebecca called the park. Linda Cho pulled his permit and frowned at the dates. Search operations began on November 8th, when the first snow of the season was already dusting the high peaks. Rangers found Dylan's van at the Wilderness Trailhead parking area near Happy Isles, exactly where it should have been. Inside, a spare jacket, receipts from a gas station in Fresno, empty coffee cups, a Tom Waits cassette tape stuck in the player. His wallet was missing. So were his cameras, a Nikon F3 and a Hasselblad medium format, both of which Rebecca knew he treated like children. The initial search focused on the upper Merced River watershed, the area Dylan had indicated on his permit. 40 rangers and volunteers hiked the steep terrain, where tributaries like Illilouette Creek and Echo Creek tumbled down to join the main stem of the Merced. They walked the banks, scrambled over boulders, called his name until their voices went hoarse. The river ran through narrow sections there, steep-sided and shadowed, where granite walls rose hundreds of feet and the water churned white over fallen logs and stone ledges. Search dogs picked up a scent trail along the riverbank, about 8 miles upstream from the trailhead, but lost it where the trail climbed away from the water toward the higher elevations. A campsite was found. Fire ring, flattened grass, a tent stake, but there was no way to confirm it was Dylan's. Dozens of people camped in that area during autumn. The search continued for 3 weeks, then scaled back to periodic sweeps. Winter came hard that year, snow piling 5 feet deep in the high country, and the search was suspended until spring. Rebecca moved to El Portal in February. She took a job waiting tables at a restaurant that served tourists heading into the park, and she spent every free moment hiking the trails Dylan might have walked. She carried copies of his photograph, dark hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a slight smile that never quite reached his eyes, and showed it to everyone, hikers, climbers, rangers, locals who'd lived in the shadow of those granite cliffs their whole lives. Most people were kind. Some avoided eye contact. A few shared stories of their own losses, sons or husbands or friends who'd walked into the wilderness and never walked back out. The official search resumed in May, after snowmelt had swollen the rivers and creeks into roaring torrents that made conversation impossible anywhere near the water. Rangers searched downstream this time, following the Merced as it carved through the steep gorge below Yosemite Valley, the section where the river dropped 70 feet per mile and the banks were composed of boulders the size of cars. They searched the eddies and pools where debris collected, the places where a body might wash up and snag on submerged logs. They found nothing. Rebecca started her own searches. She bought topographic maps and marked every tributary, every side canyon, every place where someone might leave the main trail. She hiked with a group of volunteers every weekend, people who'd heard about Dylan on the news or read about him in the Fresno Bee. They searched valleys and ridgelines, places the official search teams had already covered and places they hadn't. Rebecca developed a theory that Dylan might have been trying to reach one of the high alpine lakes, places like Merced Lake or Washburn Lake, where the light would have been extraordinary in October, where he could have spent days photographing reflections and weather patterns moving across the Sierra crest. Years passed. Rebecca met a man named Jake Brennan, a climbing guide who worked in the valley during tourist season. They married in a small ceremony at Glacier Point, looking out over the same wilderness that had taken her brother. She never stopped searching, but the searches became less frequent. Once a month, once a season. She had a daughter, named her Lily, and when Lily was old enough to walk, she brought her on the easy trails, teaching her to love the granite and the pine forests and the sound of water over stone. 17 years after Dylan vanished, on an April morning when snowmelt had turned the Merced into a thundering brown giant, a fisherman named Robert Yee was walking the bank near Red's Meadow, about 40 miles downstream from where Dylan's van had been parked. Robert had fished this stretch of river for 30 years, and he knew every pool and rifle, every place where rainbow trout held in the current. He saw something caught against a fallen cottonwood tree that had toppled into the river during spring floods, something square and black, tangled in branches and trailing streamers of algae. Robert waded out carefully. The current was strong enough to knock a person down, strong enough to carry them away. He grabbed the object and pulled. It was a camera bag, waterlogged and torn, held together by corrosion-stiffened zippers and disintegrating nylon straps. Inside, impossibly, were 2 cameras. The Nikon was destroyed, its body cracked open, film cartridge missing, internal mechanisms clogged with 17 years of sediment. But the Hasselblad, built like a tank and sealed against weather, had survived. The film back was still attached. Robert carried it to shore and called the park service. Rebecca got the call 3 days later. She drove to park headquarters with her hands shaking so badly that Jake had to take the wheel. Linda Cho was still working there, grey-haired now, close to retirement. She led Rebecca into a back office where the camera bag was laid out on a table like evidence in a trial. Rebecca touched the bag, ran her fingers over places where Dylan's hands had gripped it, where the strap had worn the fabric smooth. She identified a tear in the corner that Dylan had repaired with duct tape. The cameras were his. The film was sent to a specialist lab in Sacramento, a place that worked with law enforcement and archival restoration. The technicians were pessimistic. Film that had been submerged for 17 years, exposed to temperature fluctuations and chemical breakdown, usually yielded nothing. But the Hasselblad's film back had maintained a seal. Water had seeped in, but slowly, and the film had been protected by its metal canister. They worked for 6 weeks, using careful chemical processes to separate the film layers, to coax images from emulsion that had been degraded to the edge of usability. 23 images were recoverable. Rebecca sat in the lab with Jake and Linda Cho and a detective from the Mariposa County Sheriff's Office, and they looked at the photographs on a light box, one by one. The first dozen were landscapes, the kind of work Dylan had been known for. Morning light on El Capitan, the Merced River flowing through a meadow, grasses golden with autumn, a grove of aspen trees, leaves turned yellow and trembling in wind that had blown 17 years ago. Then the images changed. Dylan had photographed another person, a man, probably in his 40s, with a weathered face and a beard going grey. He wore a flannel shirt and a baseball cap, and in the first image he was sitting by a campfire, holding a tin cup, looking directly at the camera with an expression Rebecca couldn't quite read. The next images showed the same man standing near the river, then walking away from the camera up a narrow trail. In one photograph he was looking back over his shoulder, and his expression had shifted into something harder, something that made Rebecca feel cold in the overheated lab. The final recovered image was taken from ground level, as if the camera had been dropped or placed on rocks. It showed a section of riverbank, out of focus, and what might have been boots, someone standing very close. The angle was wrong. The composition was chaotic. It was the kind of photograph Dylan would never have taken intentionally. The detective, a soft-spoken woman named Angela Park, took copies of all the images. She ran the photographs through missing persons databases, showed them to rangers and long-time residents of the gateway communities around Yosemite. Nobody recognized the man in the flannel shirt. Angela's investigation revealed that in October of the year Dylan disappeared, 3 other hikers had reported uncomfortable encounters with a man camping alone near the upper Merced River. The descriptions varied. One said the man was friendly, another said he seemed paranoid, a third said he'd followed them for over a mile before turning back. But all 3 described a bearded man in his 40s wearing a flannel shirt and baseball cap. Angela searched records going back to the 1980s. She found 2 other disappearances in the same general area of the park, both solo male hikers, both in autumn. One in 1984, one in 1992. Neither body had been recovered. She found reports of a suspicious person camping illegally in the backcountry, someone who rangers had tried to locate multiple times, but never caught. The reports stopped after November of the year Dylan vanished. Rebecca spent weeks studying the photographs. She looked at Dylan's images of the man, trying to understand what her brother had seen, what he'd felt. Had he been afraid? Had he known something was wrong? The photographs were careful, composed, taken with Dylan's usual attention to light and framing. They didn't look like the work of someone in fear. Until that final image, the one taken from the ground, off balance, wrong. That one told a different story. Jake suggested Rebecca talk to a retired ranger named William Cross, who'd worked in Yosemite for 40 years and knew the backcountry better than anyone. Rebecca found him living in a small house in Mariposa, tending a garden of vegetables and native plants. William looked at the photographs for a long time, his weathered hands steady on the prints. He pointed to the background of one image, where a distinctive rock formation was visible behind the bearded man. "That's near Merced Peak Fork," he said, "maybe 10, 11 miles up from the trailhead. There's a side canyon there, real steep, doesn't show on most maps. Old prospecting trail from the 1870s. People camp back in there sometimes when they want to be alone." Angela Park organized a search of the side canyon. It took 2 days to reach the location, hauling search equipment and a cadaver dog up trails that had degraded to bare suggestions in the granite. The canyon was narrow, choked with manzanita and fallen timber, the kind of place that swallowed sound. They found an old campsite deep in the canyon, hidden from the main trail by a shoulder of rock. Stone fire ring, rusted cans, a tarp shelter that had rotted to fragments, and buried under a pile of rocks near the base of a Jeffrey pine, they found bones. DNA testing took 8 weeks. The bones were human, male, but they weren't Dylan's. Dental records eventually identified them as belonging to a hiker named Thomas Ridley, who disappeared from the park in 1992. Thomas had been 51 years old. A software engineer from Portland who'd taken a solo backpacking trip and never returned home. His family had searched for years. Now, finally, they had an answer, and it was worse than not knowing. The search of the canyon continued. They brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, a team of forensic archaeologists. In a depression 50 yards from the first burial site, they found a second set of remains. These were older, damaged by animals and weather and the slow work of soil chemistry. Forensic analysis suggested they'd been there since the mid-1980s. They matched the dental records of a missing person from 1984, a geology student named Kevin Porter, who'd been 27 years old when he hiked into the Sierra Nevada and disappeared. But they didn't find Dylan. Angela Park believed the camera bag had washed down from somewhere upstream, carried by spring floods that regularly rearranged the Merced's course, moving boulders and stripping away riverbanks. Dylan's body could be buried under tons of sediment, wedged in a crack in bedrock, or carried all the way down to the Central Valley and scattered across miles of riverbed. The mountains kept their secrets. They always had. Rebecca accepted that she would probably never bury her brother. But the photographs gave her something. Proof that Dylan had lived those final days, doing what he loved, seeing light on water and stone, making images that would outlast him. She had the recovered photographs printed and framed, and she included them in a gallery show of Dylan's work that traveled to museums in San Francisco, Seattle, and Denver. Thousands of people saw Dylan's final images. They saw the landscapes he'd loved, and they saw the face of the man who might have killed him, a man who was never identified, never found, whose bones might be scattered in some forgotten canyon, or who might have walked out of the wilderness and disappeared into an ordinary life. On quiet days, Rebecca hiked up to the meadow where Dylan had photographed the autumn aspens, the image preserved on film that had floated for 17 years in the cold waters of the Merced. She sat on the rocks and listened to the river, the same sound Dylan had heard in his final days. The water ran clear over granite smoothed by millennia of flow, indifferent to human tragedy, indifferent to loss. It ran toward the valley, toward the distant ocean, carrying sediment and memory and everything that fell into its current. Above, the granite cliffs rose into blue October sky, and the light fell the way it always had, beautiful and exact, and utterly without mercy. Lily grew up hearing stories about the uncle she'd never met. She learned to use a camera, spent summers hiking the same trails Dylan had walked. When she turned 18, Rebecca gave her one of Dylan's lenses, an old manual focus piece of glass that had somehow survived in storage when everything else was lost. Lily carried it into the wilderness and made her own images, and sometimes Rebecca wondered if that was a kind of resurrection, her brother's vision continuing through another generation, seeing light and stone and the patient cruelty of mountains that outlasted everyone who loved them. The investigation remained open but dormant. Angela Park retired, and the case files were passed to a younger detective who reviewed them periodically but had no new leads to follow. The photographs of the bearded man were kept in a database, cross-referenced against unsolved cases throughout the western states. No matches were ever found. If he'd killed 3 men in the wilderness of Yosemite, he'd gotten away with it. Or the mountains had claimed him too, and his bones were lying in some canyon where no human would ever walk again. Rebecca kept searching, though less frequently as arthritis settled into her knees and the trails grew steeper with age. She organized an annual memorial hike on the anniversary of Dylan's disappearance, and people came, some who'd known Dylan, some who'd only heard his story, some who were searching for their own missing loved ones and needed to be around others who understood that particular species of grief. They hiked together through autumn light that looked exactly like the light in Dylan's photographs, and they scattered wildflower seeds at the trailhead, small gestures against the overwhelming indifference of stone and water. The camera that had floated for 17 years was eventually placed in a display case at the Yosemite Museum in the valley. Visitors could see it behind glass, corroded, battered, its leather covering peeled away, but still recognizably the tool of an artist. A placard explained its history. Children pressed their faces against the glass and asked their parents what happened to the man who owned it, and parents struggled to answer, to explain how someone could simply vanish, how wilderness could swallow a person so completely that not even bones remained. But the photographs survived. 23 images recovered from film that should have been destroyed, that had been preserved by chance and cold water and the stubborn durability of German engineering. They hung in galleries and appeared in photography journals and were studied by students learning the craft Dylan had mastered. And in every image, even the landscapes empty of people, even the simple studies of light on water, viewers sensed something beneath the beauty, a loneliness, a quiet acknowledgement of how small humans were against the vast geological patience of mountains. Years after the camera was found, a ranger named Michael Torres was patrolling a remote section of the upper Merced River Canyon during low water in late September. The drought had dropped water levels to historical lows, exposing sections of riverbed that were usually submerged. Michael was documenting the conditions when he found something wedged between two boulders in a deep pool. It was a wallet, ancient and disintegrating, held together by corrosion and silt. Inside was a driver's license, the photograph barely visible, but the name still legible: Dylan Ross Grant. The location was marked, the coordinates recorded. Divers searched the pool but found nothing else. The river had carried Dylan somewhere, held him for a while in that deep hole, then let him go when the spring floods came. He was part of the sediment now, part of the mountains, scattered across miles of riverbed or buried so deep under stone that no search would ever find him. Rebecca accepted the wallet from Michael Torres in a quiet ceremony at the park headquarters. She held it in her hands, this final piece of her brother, and she felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, exactly, but the beginning of an ending. She buried the wallet at the small cemetery in El Portal, under a marker that bore Dylan's name and the dates of his too short life. Family and friends gathered on a cold November morning, the same season when Dylan had disappeared. They told stories, shared memories, looked at photographs. The mountains rose behind them, dusted with new snow, beautiful and remote and keeping their secrets. The Merced River ran through the valley below, its sound a constant murmur, carrying water from the high country down to the world beyond the granite walls. Rebecca lived another 12 years, long enough to see Lily graduate with a degree in photojournalism, long enough to attend a retrospective of Dylan's work at a major museum, long enough to publish a book that collected his photographs and told his story. The book was dedicated to everyone still searching. It sold well, and some of the proceeds went to search and rescue organizations in national parks. Rebecca had turned her grief into something useful, something that might help other families avoid her decades of not knowing. When Rebecca died, her ashes were scattered in the meadow where Dylan had photographed the aspens, the place captured in one of the recovered images. Lily and Jake hiked up on an October morning when the light was perfect, when the air smelled like pine and old stone, and they stood by the river and let Rebecca return to the wilderness she'd never stopped searching. The water carried her downstream, the same route Dylan's camera had traveled, the same patient flow that had been moving through these mountains for millions of years and would continue long after every human name was forgotten. Lily continued her uncle's work in her own way, documenting wilderness and the people who loved it and were sometimes destroyed by it. She made a series of photographs about missing persons in national parks, portraits of families still waiting, landscapes that had swallowed sons and daughters and brothers and sisters. The series was exhibited nationally and won awards, but Lily never felt like she'd captured what she was looking for. That specific quality of absence, the shape that loss carved into the world. The man in the flannel shirt was never identified. His face, hung in ranger stations and sheriff's offices, was posted on websites dedicated to unsolved cases, was shown on television programs about park mysteries. Tips came in periodically. Someone's uncle, someone's neighbor, someone who'd worked at a remote campground in the 1990s. None led anywhere. He remained a ghost, a photograph taken 17 years before it was developed, a face that had stared into Dylan's camera on what might have been the last day of Dylan's life. The side canyon, where Thomas Ridley and Kevin Porter were buried, was closed to hiking, marked as a law enforcement area. It returned to wilderness, manzanita growing over the disturbed soil, the Jeffrey pine standing watch over ground that had been excavated and documented and finally left alone. Sometimes hikers got turned around and ended up there by accident, and they felt the wrongness of the place without understanding why, the sense that something bad had happened here, and the land remembered. Dylan's photographs continued to find audiences. A gallery in New York featured his work alongside other artists who'd died young. A documentary filmmaker made a short film about his disappearance, using his images to tell the story. Photography students wrote theses analyzing his composition and use of light. His work lived on, even as the man himself became more myth than memory, a cautionary tale told around campfires, a name in databases of the missing. The Hasselblad camera that survived 17 years in the river was eventually transferred to the Smithsonian Institution, where it became part of an exhibition about photography and wilderness. Visitors from around the world saw it and heard Dylan's story, and some were moved to tears, and some were angry at the injustice of it, and some simply moved on to the next exhibit. The camera remained, a testament to durability and chance, and the strange ways that stories survive when people do not. On October mornings, when the light is right, hikers walking the trails along the upper Merced River sometimes pause and take photographs, not realizing they're standing where Dylan might have stood, seeing light on water that looks exactly as it did 17 years ago, and 17 years before that, and 17 years into a future that will continue regardless of human witness. The river runs clear and cold over granite shaped by ancient glaciers, carrying snowmelt toward the valley, toward the ocean, indifferent and eternal. And somewhere in the sediment, mixed with stone and sand and the bones of trees, Dylan Grant has become part of the mountains he loved, part of the light he spent his life trying to capture, scattered and lost, and finally, impossibly, home.